This is John Wayne Gacy. Most people know him as the Killer Clown, the Chicago contractor who murdered 33 young men and buried them beneath his house. But what if I told you that that's only the tip of the iceberg, and there are way darker and way more fascinating things about this story? There's a lot of evidence to suggest that Gacy may not have acted alone, and that John Wayne Gacy was not just a random serial killer, but a cog in a much larger trafficking serial killer network, something so large that the authorities may have looked the other way because the truth would have implicated very powerful people in government. And in this video, we're going to explore John Wayne Gacy, the men around him, and the world that made his crimes possible. But first, we need to start with the official story. Who was John Wayne Gacy, and how did he become the most infamous clown in America? John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago on March 17, 1942. Gacy grew up in a violent household with an abusive father. After high school, Gacy married and moved to Iowa in 1964, where he became a respected member of the local JCs, which is kind of like a civic organization for young business people. And he promoted himself as a sort of respectable pillar in the community. But in 1968, this facade cracked when he was arrested for sexually assaulting a young teenage employee of his. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. However, he was released on parole in 1970, only having served just 18 months. Gacy returned to Chicago and reinvented himself completely, and started a successful construction company, becoming active in local Democratic politics. From here, he started rubbing shoulders with people in power. Gacy would host neighborhood parties, he would volunteer at civic events, and he most notably would dress up as Pogo the Clown for charity events. He was photographed with high-ranking Chicago Democrats, and famously, he had a photo taken with First Lady Rosalind Carter in 1978. Secret Service agents even gave him a special clearance badge for this event. This detail is pretty important because it shows the kind of protective bubble that Gacy was operating in. He was connected, trusted, and seen as a safe figure in his community, which made it much easier for him to get away with what he was doing. To all around him, he seemed like a model citizen, a successful contractor, and just an all-around normal man. However, between 1972 and 1978, this respectable exterior concealed something far darker. It was during this time that Gacy would lure young men to their deaths, and burying most of them in his crawl space while maintaining this clean public image. However, the official story only seems to scratch the surface. While it's true that Gacy did murder these young men, and it's likely that he enjoyed doing it as a serial killer, the rationale for doing it and the reason why he got away with it for so long seems to go unnoticed. Before that, though, let's talk about the victims that Gacy would choose. Typically, his victims would often be runaways from troubled homes, or they were young gay men, or some were involved in prostitution. Gacy would typically choose the victims whom people wouldn't notice if they went missing. However, here's a weird detail about the murders. The murders that were committed weren't evenly distributed. What do I mean? So some periods were relatively low in the amount of people who went missing, while others saw multiple victims disappearing and dying within weeks of each other. The pattern sort of suggests potential external factors that influenced Gacy's activities. We'll expand on that later, and you'll see a bigger picture emerge. But first, we need to talk about another serial killer who surprisingly had the exact same style of killing and did the exact same things as John Wayne Gacy. And he's also a famous killer too, if you're into the true crime genre. And that's Dean Corrl, or the Candyman, who operated from 1970 to 1973. Dean Arnold Corrl was born on December 24th in 1939 in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He grew up in a relatively normal suburban household, although he was described as having been somewhat awkward and may have had some OCD tendencies. After graduating high school and after being discharged from the Army, he moved to Houston, Texas, where he ended up opening a small candy business. To most people, he appeared to be a quiet and polite young man. By day, he was the friendly candyman, However, by night, he was the serial killer who preyed on the most vulnerable boys in the city. He specifically targeted runaways and teenagers from broken homes and would offer them shelter or help as a way to lure them into his orbit. Corrl didn't act alone. He recruited young accomplices, including teenagers like Elmer Wayne Henley and David Brooks, to help him find his next victims. Corrl's ability to present himself as harmless, even friendly, allowed him to operate for years without raising any suspicion. However, this careful facade eventually unraveled. On August 1973, 17-year-old Wayne Henley called the police to report that he had shot and killed Dean Corrl in self-defense. And while exploring the scene of the crime, police found torture equipment in Corrl's home, and Henley led them to a storage shed where they discovered the bodies of 17 boys aged 13 to 19. Additional searches revealed 11 more bodies at other locations, totaling 28 known victims killed between 1970 and 1973. All of his victims were males who'd been sexually assaulted, tortured, and killed. In fact, the only reason why Dean Corrl was ever caught at all was because Wayne Henley was able to kill him. If he hadn't shot Corrl that night in 1973, these killings would have continued indefinitely. Not only that, we may not have had the information that we do now about the network that he was affiliated with. After killing Corrl, Henley began to talk, and one of the first names he implicated in these crimes was David Brooks, another young accomplice who helped lure victims. And both teenagers confessed to helping Corrl procure, torture, and kill victims in exchange for compensation. Now, what's interesting about this is that Corrl's methods were almost identical to John Wayne Gacy's. He targeted teenage boys who were either impoverished, runaways, or gay, or anything like that. He used handcuffs, or in Gacy's case, the rope trick, to restrain them, and then buried them in mass graves on their own properties. The most significant thing about this is that both Henley and Brooks independently claimed that Corrl told them that he belonged to a Dallas-based organization that bought, sold, and murdered boys. Initially, to the police, this seemed like lies from the boys in order to diminish their culpability and potential sentences. But as they investigated these tips, they soon discovered the network that they were talking about. It's also interesting to note that Gacy, like Corrl, also employed young male accomplices, David Cran and Michael Rossi, both of which claimed that Gacy spoke of being part of a larger operation, taking unexplained trips and having mysterious, random associates. So, following the tips from the Houston case, the Dallas police arrested John David Norman on August 14, 1973, who was running an interstate Dallas-based boy prostitution ring called the Odyssey Foundation. This operation used the guise of a mentorship program to traffic boys across state lines. On the surface, the Odyssey Foundation was set up to look harmless. Norman advertised it as a mentorship and self-improvement program for teenage boys, promising travel, scholarships, and connections with successful businessmen who could guide them in life. It was made to sound like a cross between the Boy Scouts and a college prep program. But obviously, the Odyssey Foundation was a front for a sprawling child prostitution and pornography network. Norman would recruit vulnerable kids, often runaways, and brought them into this so-called program. Once inside, they were photographed, profiled, and placed into catalogs. These catalogs were then circulated to paying sponsors who could order boys from this catalog. And when the police eventually raided Norman's operation in Dallas in 1973, what they found was staggering. They uncovered tens of thousands of index cards. Estimates vary, but some say at least 30,000, each one containing the name and information of the client. Many of these clients were reportedly prominent people, businessmen, politicians, even federal employees. It was basically the same thing as the Epstein client list, only way bigger. In addition to these contacts, investigators also found photographs of missing boys, and some of these images were stamped with the word kill, which unfortunately then sheds light on the potential role of people like Gacy or Corrl to be more of a disposal at the end of the network. Now here's the unfortunate thing. With all this information, you would think that this would be a huge scandal. But even today, people don't know who John Norman is. The unfortunate thing is, instead of fully exposing the network, much of this evidence was seized from Norman, including the client index of 30,000 figures, and it was eventually turned over to the US State Department. And all of that evidence implicating high-level individuals in this pedophile network was quietly destroyed. Officially, they claimed that it was considered not relevant to the cases at hand. But obviously, we all know that that's a lie. It's the same thing as with the Epstein client list. The only reason why they're not showing it is because important people are implicated.
And I will do everything, if confirmed as FBI director, to make sure the American public knows the full weight of what happened in the past and how we are going to countermand missing children and exploited children going forward.
Where's the videotape of an Epstein Island of X, Y, and Z committing these frauds? Why haven't you given it to us? Do you really think I wouldn't give that to you if it existed?
Anyways, after the Dallas raid in 1973, John David Norman was arrested and charged, and the Odyssey Foundation was quietly exposed as a front for child trafficking. And you'd think that'd be the end of it, that they would lock him up and throw away the key. But remarkably, even from behind bars, Norman continued with his work. In fact, all he did was just rebrand. While serving time, for whatever reason, Norman was given access to printing equipment inside the jail. And from within his jail cell, he was able to launch a brand new version of the Odyssey Foundation, which he called the Delta Project. The Delta Project used the same exact model. It was a newsletter and catalog system made to connect the so-called sponsors with boys. Norman began producing these materials inside the Cook County Jail in Chicago, and somehow this network was able to continue. The obvious reason why is because the authorities either didn't care, or there were figures above the FBI who were telling them not to look into it. Otherwise, why was it that John Norman was able to run a trafficking operation from within his prison? That's ridiculous. From there, he was assisted by a fellow inmate named Philip Paskey, a young man who was serving time for accessory to murder. Paskey had a long and troubling criminal history, including convictions for theft, drug offenses, and violent crimes. He was also deeply involved with John Norman's child trafficking and pornography operations. Now, this next part is what links these worlds together so that we can see just a bigger picture of how these work. Interestingly, after Norman returned to prison in June 1978, Paskey went to work for John Wayne Gacy's construction company, which demonstrates the clear link between this Chicago-based child trafficking network and John Wayne Gacy. Paskey worked for Gacy just months before the discovery of the 29 bodies, and it was during interrogation John Wayne Gacy claimed that Paskey had keys to John's house, and Paskey was involved in trafficking operations conducted from the property. Paskey's prior experience with Norman's network, combined with his access to Gacy's home and construction business, suggest he may have played a coordinating role in connecting these two parts of the larger trafficking operation, clearly acting as this bridge between Norman's interstate network and Gacy's serial killing.
There's a misconception of what the house on Summerdale is. It's not a house where you work 9 to 5 and come home, and it's like a house where you live in. The living room was the private office section. One of the bedrooms was a terrarium. The kitchen was more like a fast food kitchen. There's others involved. At the time of my arrest, there was 4 other suspects. 3 of the suspects that we knew that they knew then was Michael Rossi, David Cram, and Philip Paskey, all employees of PDM contractors, all with keys to the house on Summerdale.
And while Gacy himself is really not the most credible of a source, it does align with what we do know about the network already. But this is the obvious connection between John Norman, who was in charge of this crime syndicate, and John Wayne Gacy, who seemed to be a cog affiliated with this network in the same way that Dean Corrl was. 2 men who had a very similar job. Here's the most interesting thing about it, though. There is a striking correlation between Norman's activity and Gacy's victim count. During the 5 years when Norman was in prison or absent from Chicago, only 7 victims linked to Gacy disappeared. However, during the 2 years that Norman was actively operating in Chicago, 20 victims went missing. Now take that for whatever that means, but it's interesting that it's significantly higher when Norman is there, as if John Wayne Gacy, like Dean Corrl, operated as some lower level aspect of this network, some sort of disposal unit of the network. Now, this really only scratches just a little bit of the surface of this whole topic, This is a really fascinating topic, but there's a lot of really dark stuff that you can't really talk about on YouTube here. So on my Patreon, I've posted a video explaining more detail into the network itself and how that network worked. So if you find that interesting, go ahead and check that out. It's linked in the description and a pinned comment. So with that, I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this. So thanks for watching, and God bless.